bone of contention last year that led to the Gen Z protests. We're now seeing Gen Zs back on the front pages. People Daily talks about how Ruto machinery killed brave Gen Z, and this one unmoved by bloodshed. The fact that we've gone for a long period of time without talking about why those people were out in the streets, it was mainly to do with the budget-making process. Now we're deep in it, and now we're talking about this Gen Zs again. Do you find it curious that it's all happening around this time? Is it an indication of what could happen again this year? Well,
justice delayed is justice denied. So anyone trying to push the narrative that the release of the documentary is actually timed to coincide with the budget-making process really fails to actually see the problem here. That number one, we've had 10 months where the government has done nothing about it. In any case, the very things that made young people very angry to come to the streets are now being perpetrated with a lot of impunity. And if you look at the two shooting instances, now take time and look at the documentary one more time, you realize that in both shooting instances, there was no apparent threat to the officers. Let's look at Parliament. Let's start with Parliament, where there's that KDF officer who's actually been singled out. He shot a fleeing man. You know, if it was even frontal, two people facing each other, there would be the argument, the officer would argue, for argument's sake, that that was an aggressor coming his way. This is a person who shot a fleeing. Really, there was nothing warranting the use of lethal fire. Secondly, look at the other shooting part of it that is actually highlighted. The demonstrators had actually been pushed back. And then the officer goes on his knees. At that particular point, again, there was nothing imminent that forced that officer. Because if you look at that particular team, let's call it a platoon for purposes of demonstrating, go back there and then look at it. The officers are even walking casually, calling each other, Kujeni tuende. It was not in the throes of actually a fight. There were different events that actually happened. There are so many scenes during that particular period where there were confrontations, push, but during those particular intense moments, we have not seen in places where people were shot. But in this particular documentary, specifically around Parliament, the two instances where people are shot, the specific ones, you realize that there was no direct confrontation, even with the people who were actually shooting. Both in Parliament, 25 meters, for a person who's running away and he is unarmed. First of all, they're fleeing. There was no need to open up their heads. That cannot be explained, you cannot rationalize. Secondly, again, the other one, like I've actually just said, you go back to the documentary, you realize again, there was no danger directly to the officer because they already had pushed them back. And the officers were walking casually as they pushed them back. It wasn't like, many times you've seen when people are pushing each other. That was not the reason. So the shootings around Parliament had very little to do with a real threat, an operational threat for the officers where discretion for the use of firearms actually was there. It was for other purposes altogether because no one was shot in the chamber. People were inside the chamber. Mm-hmm. No one was shot within the corridors. Yet they were there and the officers were there. Why are you shooting people as they run away and leave? So there is no justification, and we should not try to rationalize that. Once it comes to fundamental human rights, we cannot have explanations on why the police broke the law. Same thing with what is happening in Kilgoris today. There is no explanation whatsoever from the police that can actually explain why there was an operation that even the police commander did not know. The county administration didn't know. And if you look at that particular unit, it was there specifically to cause that particular mayhem. So I do not think that we can push this narrative that it's been said to coincide with that. But then, looking at especially those that are defending, from the Kenya Kwanza side, you realize, you see an animal farm kind of setting where Napoleon is always right until he says otherwise. And everybody else, including Honorable Kiari and the others, are squealers. Always Napoleon is right. Napoleon is a character there, and squealer is a man running propaganda. So you look at people who are trying to justify that. They have no other explanation other than if anything paints them badly, then they stand out and have to defend it. There is no defense of what happened in Parliament on that day because Fred, the question of command responsibility must be addressed. Who was in charge of the Nairobi command at that hour? The IG then, who was Koome, for example, no one has actually done anything about it. And now that the military was part and parcel of this, at that particular point, it was still Kahariri who was actually in charge, because he'd come to office, I think, around April. So that is an issue. Finally, this stops right at the doors of the president. Command responsibility will come from the Nairobi command, the military leadership at that particular point, and the president himself, who somehow is glossing over this. And when violence and the police make mistakes in places where he holds dear, especially in his backyard, then you see, like yesterday, the IG and the DCI were all in Kilgoris. Because it's a place where, for example, the president considers to be his basket of votes. So somehow he's deploying everything to go there and take care of that. Okay. It's unfair, yet when it comes to the Gen Zs, something that happened so long time ago, just to deal with these issues, they are still going around, and they think now that BBC Malala and Blood Parliament is echoes of war. It's not going to go down that easily.
Okay. Now, the government must be concerned, especially the president, that